All right, welcome to our latest explainer. Today, we're diving into a really high-stakes battle, one that starts on the factory floors of South Carolina and goes all the way to the steps of the Supreme Court. It's a story about tariffs, presidential power, and really the future of American industry. So it really all comes down to this one big question. When the U.S. is facing a major economic threat from another country, what can a president actually do about it? And does their emergency toolkit include one of the most powerful and, let's be honest, controversial tools out there? Tariffs? Well, that fight is happening as we speak. It's a Supreme Court case, Trump v. VOS Selections, Inc. And at the heart of it are these really controversial tariffs from the Trump administration, which got the nickname the Liberation Day tariffs. And look, this is not some dusty old legal debate about nothing. This case is all about the future of a huge American industry, electric vehicles. These tariffs were put in place specifically to try and shield U.S. companies from what the government was calling predatory Chinese imports that were threatening to just flood the market.
Now, in a case like this, you'd probably expect the main players to be, massive corporations or these big DC think tanks. But this is where the story takes a really sharp turn, and we hear from a voice you might not expect at all.
And here's where it gets really interesting. The South Carolina African American Chamber of Commerce, a group that represents local, minority-owned businesses, was asked to weigh in. They were asked to file what's called an amicus curiae brief, which basically means they get to advise the court as a friend. So you got to ask, why would a local chamber of commerce jump into a massive Supreme Court showdown?
Well, for the members of this chamber, this isn't some abstract legal idea. For them, it is all about survival. It's about whether their businesses are even going to have a future in one of the fastest-growing industries on the planet. You see, for these businesses, the Supreme Court's decision isn't just theory. It hits their bottom line hard. We're talking about contracts to supply parts to major auto plants. We're talking about jobs in communities like Spartanburg and Charleston. It's about whether minority entrepreneurs will get a real shot in the EV revolution or if they'll just get shut out by foreign competition. And this is the incredible perspective the chamber brings to the table. While lawyers in Washington are arguing legal theory, the chamber can tell the 9 justices what's actually happening on the ground. They can explain that for their members, these protective tariffs aren't just a policy. They are a lifeline for real people, for local entrepreneurs, and for entire communities. Okay, so to understand how this whole thing is going to be decided, we have to look at the legal heart of this conflict. It all comes down to how you interpret one very, very powerful law. And that law is the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEPA for short. It was passed back in 1977, and the idea was to give the president a sort of flexible toolkit to deal with unusual and extraordinary threats to the country, and that includes threats that are economic, not just military. So here's the fundamental disagreement. A lower court looked at this and said, hey, the law, IEPA, doesn't explicitly use the word tariffs, so the president can't use them. But the government's argument is that that completely misses the point. They're saying the law gives the president broad power to regulate imports during an emergency, and tariffs are, one of the most classic tools of economic regulation there is. The Supreme Court's decision here isn't just going to affect EV factories. It's going to define how every future president can defend American industries. It's really about what tools are in the nation's economic toolkit when businesses, like the ones in South Carolina, feel like they are facing completely unfair foreign competition. And for groups like the South Carolina Chamber, the clock is ticking, and it's ticking fast. To make sure their voice gets heard, they have to navigate this really tight legal schedule. Deadlines for their brief are coming up this fall, right before the court is set to hear the arguments in November.
And getting your story in front of the Supreme Court isn't simple. The chamber has to go through this whole process, formally authorize it, coordinate all the complex legal arguments, review every single word internally, and then file it all perfectly, right on time. It's a huge undertaking, but it's the only way they can get their real-world perspective in front of those justices.
So in the end, it all comes down to this: a clash between presidential power on one side and the survival of local businesses on the other. This case forces us to ask a really critical question. In our totally interconnected world, where do you draw the line? When does protecting Main Street justify a president using the full economic might of the White House? The Supreme Court's answer is going to echo for decades.